The afternoon was quiet and very still. I lay on the narrow peasant bed, looking out on the yellow glory of the lemon tree in front of my window. From away in the distance came the fading song of a company on the march. They were over the days of Sidi Pass and Castoria, of the passage across the Gulf of Corinth, of the great victory parade in Athens. We had stormed our way through the pages of history. Corinth, Delhi thieves, the Pass of Tupi, the raging Acropolis. Everywhere cheering, elated crowds. We had felt a sigh of relief which went up from men and women, even from children, because we had come and not the Italians. We had been swept up in a hot wave of happiness, as so many times before, as in Hungary, in Romania, in Bulgaria. Our tanks had rolled over a carpet of Bulgarian roses. We had drunk wine with Macedonian peasants and shared their bread and salt. The Bulgan campaign was over. Once again, we had been the faster and tougher ones. Yet, even so, for all our pride, we could not escape a shadow of discontent. We knew by now only too well that the Italians were no more than a few days' march behind us. Their army communique proudly proclaiming the capture of towns and villages that we had handed over to them. I could not forget the eyes of that old woman in monsoon, who, gazing in horror at the waving plumes of the Baleri, had said to me in an uncomprehending voice, "So that's it? This is a bad thing you've done, you Germans." Suddenly, I was jolted from my dream. The ceiling was rocking with a leap. I was out of the window and wedged in the broad branches of the lemon tree. An earthquake in Lissa. But it did not last long. A few short tremors, and then the earth settled down and became quiet. Whereupon the peasant family came rushing up to my tree, crossing themselves in wild excitement and shouting to me, heedless of the fact that I did not understand a word. Shaking my head, I left my involuntary perch, which reminded me of happy days in my youth, climbed down to earth, and ran off to the beats.
Company orderly room, where I found an uproar. Our Alpine troops crowding around the first sergeant, all talking at once. It was a moment before I realized that it was not all about the earthquake. The men had been listening to an enemy broadcast and had come to ask if it were true what they were saying, that Rudolf Hess, the deputy of the Führer, had parachuted into Britain. That, of course, seemed to be the wildest nonsense. We scoffed at those terrific light infantrymen from Styria and the Bavarian Alps. They departed unconvinced. Evening brought confirmation. Rudolf Hess had jumped into enemy country. He wanted to bring about peace, all in vain. Needless to say, we were stunned, touched by the breath of an unknown terror. Everyone talked without listening. In the end, we fell into an uneasy silence. Next morning, the commander sent for me to receive a highly secret order. He hesitated a moment and cleared his throat. Finally, he said, "Get all the information you can on Soviet Russia and the part of Poland occupied by Russia in 1939. I looked at him in blank incomprehension. He said abruptly, "We're moving east. We're going to finish this everlasting threat." My first reaction was sheer horror. I remembered Hess's words in Mein Kampf about a war on two fronts. Then the statement that had been issued after the signing of the pact with Russia, a pact that had come as such a shock, especially to National Socialists, but which had, in fact, simply taken account of the real facts of the situation. Now this was all to be thrown overboard. A threat indeed. It was one of the gravest threats, not only to Germany, but to the whole world. But did it have to be then? Before we were through with the other guys, another damned war on two fronts? Most of my friends had been horrified by the pact with the Kremlin, but I had felt relief. That had been a featuring worthy of the Iron Chancellor himself. It was what he would have done, grasped the bull by the horns, smashed the encirclement, if there were no other choice. If it had to be war,
then let it at least wait until we had cleared our backs. Now all at once it was all being swept away. And then I thought, but this is sheer nonsense. He's putting on an act. It isn't true. It can't be true. But it was true enough, and it was unavoidable. When there had been only a few German divisions securing on the eastern frontier, the Red Army was concentrating with all of its strength.
The men were completely unconcerned. It was all the same to them. They were used to marching, to fighting, to dying if need be, but always as victors. It was not often that any man stopped to think about things. Back in Vienna, I ran into a friend, a man closely connected with the Foreign Office Information Service. He refused to see him. He spluttered. He wouldn't even see him one time. Who? What? Damn it, I asked. The Führer. He refused to see old Count Schulenburg, the ambassador in Moscow, you know. He caught Hitler at the Hotel Imperial. He had all the documents in his briefcase concerning the true status of the Red Army. It said that Molotov himself had seen to it that got them. Probably in the hope of stalling off the decision, Schulenburg brought his own intelligence reports as well. But Ribbentrop stopped him in the corridor and told him the Führer's mind was made up, that his decision was irrevocable, and that he couldn't even be received. Schulenburg was livid. He said it wasn't as though he'd committed a crime. His information was of the highest importance. But Ribbentrop would hardly let him speak. It just wasn't going to happen, no matter what he may have. The Führer had already decided. I was silent. After a while, I said angrily, "This is all nonsense. You journalists let your imagination run away with you. It would do you good to get out and see us for a bit. You'd soon forget all about it." He gave a nod. "I'm going to, as soon as I can. I wish to God you were right, and it was only a house rumor. But it's gone beyond that. It's damn near an official story." I said goodbye to my mother and then used the rest of my short leave to pay a quick visit to my former boss, Gitter Josef Burkel. He was in excellent spirits and radiated confidence. "Send me a postcard from Moscow," was his cheerful parting. "Your guys won't waste any time. And then, look out." England. My brigade, the Lyanda, Adolf Hitler was in Brunn when the news broke that war against the Soviet Union had begun. There was very nearly mutiny in the ranks. Although the Lyandata, Hitler's elite bodyguard formation, is commonly considered a division, it did not officially gain that status until after the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. As it underwent a number of designations throughout the war years, ending with the 1st SS Panzer Division, Lyandata, SS Adolf Hitler, it will simply be referred to as the Lyandata throughout the text. Brunn is the German name for the current town of Brno in the Czech Republic. At the time, it was heavily populated with ethnic Germans, the Student and the Deutscher. Where do we fit in? You can bet your ass we're going to miss the whole show. Didn't the Führer promise we'd be in on everything? We're stuck here, while the others will soon be entering Moscow. We spent the night drinking, and after I had had a few drinks, more than I could really handle, I was soon swept up in the general wave of confidence. We passed round newspaper articles. Their authors, white Russian refugees, predicted the immediate breakup of the Soviet Union. We listened in breathless excitement to the first armed forces daily reports and passed on their contents to the others. At last, on the third day, our convoys moved out and began to roll toward the east. In Silesia, we found cheering and waving people everywhere, crowds almost frantic with delight. Old men, veterans from the first Russian campaign, spent hours by our resting columns, showering them with advice on how to eliminate the Kamaks and the Russian infantry. Women stuffed us with food and cigarettes, too much to take with us, let alone to consume on the spot. Happy, shouting children followed us everywhere. Girls, didn't know, hugged us and covered us with kisses. But soon, our nostrils were filled with the stench of burning villages. The air trembled with the distant rumble of guns. Our hearts beat faster, seasoned though we were to war. Tomorrow's battle never fails to put a clamp around the heart. We hastily wrote our first postcards home. Then the curtain rose on the great drama which was to hold us all in its spell for so many long years. Whenever there are differing place names, they will be indicated in the text with square brackets. The division had been on the march since dawn.
For hours, it had rumbled past smouldering, reeking houses. We saw the first dead lying beside the road. The troops looked at them closely, furiously, and with mounting excitement. They were the bodies of men from Siberian and Mongolian regiments, men whom the reeling giant of a nation had torn from their homes in the east and thrown in to defend its threatened frontier in the west. The thunder of the battle rolled close ahead of us. Waves of Kurubi's armor had pushed deep into enemy country, thrusting far ahead on the northern route of advance. Where they had come in sight of Kyiv, once the enemy had recovered from the shock of our first onslaught, his forces had advanced in waves, in front of, behind, and on both sides of our armor, which stood like a huge porcupine in the surrounding chaos. Short of fuel and out of ammunition, supplies had not arrived. Our division's mission was to clear the northern route of the enemy and allow fuel to get through to the armored spearheads. So far, we had seen nothing of the Red Air Force in the woods. We were moving through the first rounds of Soviet artillery were impacting. But they stopped almost as quickly as they had come. The battalion commander called up his liaison officer. I want you to reconnoiter the approaches to the northern route. Take a couple of men with you. The young SS Anurfura turned and pointed to his driver and me. We moved out over hilly country, pea-waving grain fields. Apparently deserted HS, with brown and blue-washed walls and golden yellow thatched roofs. Every now and then the officer looked at his map. Suddenly he turned to me, squatting in the back of the vehicle, and said in a strained voice, "The map's wrong." I looked up at him, astonished, and saw how beads of sweat were standing on his forehead. We had long since lost all sight and sound of the battalion, and had moved forward a good 10 kilometers, miles into enemy country. Everything was calm and peaceful, like a quiet Sunday morning. Even the sound of the distant tank fighting had ceased. It seemed like the church bells had to toll at any second. We raced up a steep hill from which we could see deep into the terrain, where far away, almost on the horizon, there was a broad grey ribbon. Dust clouds rose and vanished. The northern avenue of advance convoys. The officer said his poise. "Returned Ivan, bringing up reinforcements." He had the vehicle turn around and we started back. In the meantime, the battalion had been slowly following along and we met it about halfway. The officer made his short port and our vehicle remained at the head of the column. By the time we reached the hill again, the dust clouds had vanished. In the meantime, it had turned dark. We moved on and on. There was no sign of the enemy. The men were cheerful and in high spirits. I heard an NCO say, "We will be in Moscow in 6 weeks, if only Ivan will move fast enough." I sat in the vehicle looking out over the tranquil countryside, trying desperately to fight down my feverish mood. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I was certainly no stranger to war, and knew what was going on. It was our task to avert the danger from the east, to smash it and be done with it once and for all. And yet, faced with this vast expanse of land, I found myself gripped by a feeling of hopeless abandonment and fear. Fear of falling into a trap. It was, of course, ridiculous. Our armies had been triumphant everywhere. They had been the furious onslaught of our tanks had smashed the enemy. Wherever he had been found and had driven all before it, gradually the air became clearer and visibility improved. The day's haze was gone. Evening came down over the white plain, and in the fathomless forests and marshes that we passed were the first deep shadows of the night. A shout went up through the battalion. We had reached the main route of advance. Right and left of us towered the walls of the Ukrainian forests. All talking and singing had long since died. Still, not a shot. We drove on.
Our vehicle was second in the column by then, and the co waved it up. I could hear him ordering the Untersturmführer to reconnoiter a crossroads, take a sidecar motorcycle. Do it, let be more maneuverable. The Untersturmführer nodded to me. We mounted the machine and rode out into the darkness of the night. Far ahead of the battalion, I was feeling more myself again. We drove on. 1 kilometer, 2, 3, 4. Behind us, we could hear the comforting rattle of the battalion coming up fast. Suddenly, the officer had the motorcycle stop. The crossroads was just in front and to our right. Halfway in the roadside ditch was an armored car, a Russian one. The Untersturmführer lit a cigarette in a leisurely fashion. "The tanks have made a good job of that one," he said, smiling. He went up to the vehicle, one door of which was open. "I bailed," he added. He ran his hand over the roughly riveted sides of the vehicle and said, "It's a shoddy-looking job." In the meantime, I had joined him beside the vehicle. I put my head into the open door and withdrew it again. "Gives you a strange feeling all the same, Untersführer." He tried to suppress a loud laugh and stuck his head inquisitively into the car. While that was happening, I walked off to see if the old man was following up with the rest of the unit. At that moment, a shot rang out. The officer turned in surprise and dropped. A second later, the armored car started to move and headed out onto the road. The driver and I were already in the ditch. Almost by instinct, a burst of machine gun fire whipped over our heads, and before we had time to grasp what was happening, the car vanished into the night. The driver shook the officer. "You all right, Sturmführer?" There was no answer. Upset, I tried to raise him up when I supported his head. However, my hand became moist. Despite the risk, I switched on my pocket lamp for a second and then extinguished it. Right in the middle of the young officer's forehead was a neat, round hole. "Engines had it," the driver whispered, and cursed to himself. Just as we were getting ready to start up the motorcycle, there was a wild flurry of noise from the direction of the battalion. Shots whipped through the night. We looked at each other, not sure what to do. The best thing we can do is to stay where we are," the driver said. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had begun. There was no doubt that the battalion was getting closer. A few minutes later, the commander's vehicle came to a halt beside me. Somewhat shakily, I reported what had happened. The coup shouted at me at the top of his voice. I have no idea to this day what he said. He probably doesn't either. Shortly afterwards, the battalion moved on again. By that time, it had grown pitch dark, and you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. According to the map, we weren't too far from Shamir, west of the village of Kuluan. Suddenly, a few more rounds went crashing through the night. Wild confusion was the result. Orders were Bal. The young liaison officer ran past me, shouting, "Get moving! All company vehicles to move up the side road and set up 360 security." I ran on to find the first company commander I could. A few moments later, the heavy vehicles were clanking and clattering nose to tail up the side road, away from that fatal crossroads. Machine gun rounds tore into our midst, and the first wounded cried out. Self-propelled 3.7-centimeter flak at the head of the column heaved their way like gigantic ploughs through the nighttime grain field. Short bursts of fire rattled through the night. Machine gun sections formed the continuous links between the self-propelled guns. Men crouched among the huge vehicles, trying to locate the enemy tanks, clattered through it all. Light Soviet tanks. One of our vehicles caught fire, but miraculously it was put out immediately. It was an ammunition truck. The enemy fire grew heavier, bursting and crashing around our ears from all sides. There was no longer any doubt we were surrounded. Together with a few other men, unknown to me, I crouched in the ditch beside the road, firing wildly into the night. I dug in as well I could. Track whipped across the sighing grain sheaves. A hand touched my shoulder. It was Kol. "This is it," he said hoarsely. "Maybe." I tried to pass it off. "Let them find the bastards first, and then wait till morning." Kol looked me in the face. his eyes shining white in the flashes of impacting shells. "Are you afraid?" I asked. "Worried?" He smiled. "If you'd been through what I have, then you would be afraid." Of course. I also want to live." "Don't be an idiot," I interrupted. "You're not going to die that easily." Cole laughed softly. "Easier than you think." I stood, keeping my up head low, and said, "I'm going to take a leak." He tried to force me down, "Stay here," but I tore myself away and walked a couple of steps into the grain, which was tall enough to reach my shoulder. As I was standing there, taking a leak, a figure detached itself from the darkness of a few yards away. "Watch out," I said. "There's a hell of a lot of iron in the air. Supposed to be good for lung problems." "Iron in the air?" Then I saw him, unmistakably, pull out a grenade. "Ivan!" I yelled as loudly as I could, throwing myself on the ground. I had hardly reached the ground before the first bursts from Cole's submachine gun hissed across, inches away from me. I saw the Russian collapse without a sound. As quickly as I could, I jumped back into the ditch. I was unable to speak. "I joined up in 39, he went on, as if nothing had happened. "Soma's leader in a small town. You know, it was meant to be. But I was on the old side, and my heart a bit suspect. So after basic training, I went after the Toon-Cop Guard units." "Well," I said, still rattled by what had happened. "Well, you say that, what I said at the time. I was disappointed, of course, but still quite hopeful of getting into action. Instead, I found myself on concentration camp guard duty. I haven't slept properly since then. Guard at a concentration camp for a whole year. You know, a lot of what's said isn't true, or at any rate is exaggerated. But what is true is bad enough. People herded together, cooped up for years in a tiny space. I got quite friendly with one of them, in Timer, Polish university professor. Then one day he was at work as usual with the others, when he suddenly walked toward Wałęsa, the camp limits. "Shoot," he implored me in a quiet manner. "Please, shoot. I can't stand it any longer." "Stay where you are," I shouted in horror, bringing my rifle up. Those were our orders. Only that the desperate man no longer saw me or heard me. He was already in another world. I was shaking all over. "Stay where you are, for God's sake, stay where you are. You know the orders." He crossed the line with his eyes shut. I couldn't shoot. I was incapable of it. Then the neighbouring guard opened fire. I wrote to the Reichsfuhrer. I wrote to everyone I knew who had any sort of pull. I wanted to get to the front, to the front-line forces. I didn't want to be a jailer. Finally, ... Finally, ... It worked. All this, he gazed vacantly out into the fire-studded night. "This is heaven. After that, you've got nerves," I said uncomfortably. "You don't know what you're saying." He just smiled. Gradually, the Russians drew their ring of death tighter, and their fire became heavier. "Come on," cried an Untersturmführer who was unknown to me. "A few men can be pulled out here without any problem." He took Cole and me and another man by the sleeve, ammunition for the infantry guns. An Untertorführer stood on a truck and intensely observed the muzzle flashes of the nearby enemy battery. He didn't pay any attention to the RING fires around us. He was the platoon leader of the infantry guns. Besides the Flak platoon, they were our salvation. The Untertor Führer Voldemarschutz had identified the firing position of the Russians and issued brief orders. Round after round hauled through the night and impacted with a screech into the nearby enemy firing position. We breathed easier. We humped crate after crate of ammunition through the enemy fire to where the guns had taken up position in the deep. To our right there was a heavy machine gun, close by at the edge of the road, and whenever it fired, the enemy rifle fire stopped. An Oberschar Führer was directing the fire. I exchanged a few casual words with him when he praised us on how quickly we had brought up the ammunition. After we had crossed that stretch of hell for perhaps the 10th time, I crouched down at his feet and lit a cigarette. Suddenly, an invisible hand struck him behind the knees, and he sank soundlessly to the ground. "Shot in the head," Cole whispered when we turned him over. "That's the kind of death you want."
The next non-commissioned officer in command jumped up and continued to direct the fires. By the time we had staggered up with the next load of ammunition, he was also lying, stretched out beside his comrade. "You see," Cole said, lost in thought, his words cutting into my horror. "This is what I always dreamt it would be. This is the real Citus, not the concentration camps, not the Gestapo or the Scyther Heights dens, but soldiers who fight and die when they're told." He paused. "Not barbed wire fences and security zones." I was too bewildered to answer. A moment later, shells from a Soviet battery crashed into our defensive positions, but only once or twice. Then they were silenced by the salvos from our self-propelled flak and infantry guns. Towards morning, a rumor went round that all units of the division had been surrounded, and that radio contact had been lost. Shortly afterwards, the battalion commander orders came down the line. "Enemy attack expected at dawn. No one can come to our aid. The battalion will hold along. Crossroads, in accordance with orders. Quarter will neither be asked nor given. You saw the mutilated bodies of your comrades yesterday afternoon, and know what to expect." Up towards morning, the enemy fire suddenly ceased. Everyone sat in his makeshift trench or in the shelter of a vehicle. I piled up ammo clips beside me to have everything within reach. They would probably be enough for 2 hours after that, but it was no use thinking about that. For half an hour, there was no firing. Our nerves were stretched to the breaking point. If only something would happen, if only they would come. But nothing happened. An hour passed, and morning claimed its due. "In the skies, good light for firing," Carr said elaborately, lighting his pipe. I looked in the direction of the broad road to the west. I narrowed my eyes to see better. What? That was impossible. I feverishly tore across to the commanding officer's dugout. "German bicycle forces coming up from the west," I reported breathlessly. He looked at me without a word. Then he raised his field glasses. "Come on," he roared, and we leapt on the sidecar motorcycle and raced off along the line of surprise riflemen. A slow-moving and portly army major dismounted awkwardly from his bicycle, a laugh across his face. "It's crazy," he said. "I was told in the last village that they'd heard firing over here all night, but I see it's all quiet." My commander cleared his throat. "Pretty quiet," he said in a strangely thick voice. "I've only got about 40 dead." The friendly face of the major turned to stone, but my commander went on. "It seems that the enemy has withdrawn." Shortly afterwards, we climbed on the motorcycle again and rode away to the east. Soon the sky darkened and the soft rain began. The men were tired out after their sleepless night and sat wet and shivering in their combat vehicles. Above us came the sound of engines. One of theirs? No, it was ours. But then bombs began to fall. Over to our right, they had been unable to identify us in the light fog and took us for treating Soviets. Men all stood up and gestured. More bombs fell, but no one attempted to take cover. Instead there was general shouting, cursing and waving. Finally, the good man figured it out. Thoroughly ashamed of himself, he climbed steeply and disappeared. We didn't take a single casualty. Our respect for the Luftwaffe had not increased. Towards afternoon, we realized that the narrow lane we were following led into our objective, the northern route of advance. We were now close behind the Divisional Armored Assault Battalion, which showed that there was something afoot. We moved on and on. Occasionally we heard sniping, but nobody bothered to stop. It would have cost too much time. And by now, every man knew what our mission was. The armor had advanced to within a few miles of Kyiv, where they were stuck. Out of fuel, and with little food and ammunition behind them, the Russians were closing their ranks, and had our tanks nicely in the trap. Supply columns could not get through, as the main supply was enemy-held. It was our mission to free it, and allow the armor some breathing room. We moved on and on. At 4 a.m, we crossed the old Russian frontier. Later the same morning, we experienced our first Russian air raid, 30 to 40 machines at a time. We suffered 2 dead and several wounded. Towards evening, we were attacking outside the village of Romanova against stubborn Russian resistance. The enemy was thrown back. I did not see any action that evening. We took up quarters in a large collective farm. Most of the cattle belonging to it had been shot by the retreating Russians. It was there that I talked for the first time to ethnic Germans. A young woman brought us milk and honey. "Are any of your men from the Palatinate?" she asked. We were sorry to say there were not. She told us that her family originally came from the Rhine Palatinate. We asked what sort of a life they had had. Life? Oh, they got by until 1928. After that, her father had been shot. He had been against the collective farm. Perhaps he should have thought. "More of his family," she said in a tired voice, but he was always saying, "We paid for this plot of ground with our own sweat and money, and nobody was going to take it away from us." So he was shot for sabotaging the revolution. 2 of my brothers were given 10 years. We've never heard from them since. Georg, the younger one, wrote once from UTK, but nothing since then. Mother left us. Her mind gave way and she hanged herself. Hans, my husband, was taken off a month ago to dig the fences. I wonder if I'll ever see him again. I doubt it. And so I'm left alone with 3 children. The 3 little ones, 2 girls and a boy, clung shyly to their mother's skirt. We looked at each other. What amazed us was the matter of a way in which this young woman told her story, as though it were no more than trivial village gossip. We listened incredulously. An old Ukrainian spoke up. He had been a prisoner in Austria during the First War and knew a few words of German. "You must think, not that only ethnic Germans in hell," he said with some difficulty. 5 years in prison for being late for work twice. I have no watch and live a long way from the collective farm. My brother shot. He said it in the same matter-of-fact, almost indifferent voice. "But you all talk as if you are talking about a bad harvest," I said. "You tell us these horrible stories and don't seem the least bit upset." The Ukrainian smiled. "Do you know what it's like to live close to death? Nothing is as big as it first looked." We had no reply. There was no more to be said. On again next morning, through huge pine forests, over fertile hills, across enormous marshes, deeper and ever deeper into the endless land. Demolished bridges forced us to detour, but we held our course for the northern route. At last, on the 11th of July, we reached our desired objective, the main road. The lead companies rested in the dense vegetation, and groups of hills immediately in front of us were the assault guns. At about 9, a German sergeant appeared on the road without cap or belt, and Pistoy P08 in his means hand. While wiping the blood off his face, he rendered a report. An army motorcycle battalion had been encircled for 3 days in the village of Sofov, 3 kilometers north of the main road. He had been sent out in a last attempt to get help, and had spent all night infiltrating through the Soviet lines. In the end, he'd been seen and fired on, but he had got through by a miracle. A few minutes later, assault guns loaded with infantry were headed towards Sofov. The sergeant was on the first gun. We had gone some way down the road when an anti-tank gun fired. Before the first gun could reply, it was on fire. The second gun moved up. It was luckier and silenced the enemy anti-tank gun at point-blank range. We moved a few meters into the village and immediately ran into enemy fire. The infantry scrambled off the guns and took up positions in the ditch by the side of the road. I pressed myself close to the ground, steering in the direction from which the enemy fire must have come. The assault guns were firing indiscriminately into the open country. Suddenly, I saw a head move in the window of the roof of the building opposite. I found myself looking straight into the eyes of a Russian who was setting up a machine gun to fire against comrades in a defile 30 meters or so behind me. I raised my rifle and took aim. The building was not 10 meters away. As he brought up his machine gun, I pressed the trigger. The man staggered, and I distinctly saw blood trickle down his forehead. I remained where I was, motionless, incapable of moving. The men around me leaped out of the ditch and ran across the road into the building. One nudged me as he went. "You all right?" I stood up, trembling, and wiped the sweat off my forehead. My knees were weak. I had killed a man for the first time in my life, coldly
and deliberately. The next few minutes had the quality of a dream. I saw myself running through the village street with the others. To our right, an assault gun was firing its main gun and machine gun as it went. Then I was looking into sweaty, grimy faces filled with joy, dozens of hands stretched out towards me. A slim and elegant officer, his immaculate uniform making a strange contrast with his surroundings, pulled me head over heels towards him. Into cover. I've killed one, I gasped, then pulled myself together. The Oberstleutnant, a man considerably beyond 50, gave me a sharp look and then smiled. Shoot faster, son. You'll have longer to live. I settled down beside him. He brought up his rifle and fired into a patch of open ground, across which brown figures were running back and forth. I followed his example. I heard the officer say, "You did well. We were practically finished. I won't forget your division anytime soon." In the meantime, the platoon leader of the assault guns had taken a look at the situation and radioed for reinforcements. Soon, the whole assault gun battery was rolling into Isov. The Russians fell back before the pressure. The pocket grew. "Have you eaten?" the Oberstleutnant suddenly asked me. "Eaten?" I said. "No." "Then you'll be my guest." I looked at him speechless and then tried to straighten my mud-covered uniform. A soldier served the Oberstleutnant and his adjutant, a corpulent major with gleaming white paper for napkins and proper white soup bowls, with beef soup, meat, and vegetables. It was like a fairy tale. During the meal, the Oberstleutnant was continually receiving company reports and issuing orders. The meal over, I stood up and asked permission to take leave to go to my comrades, who were in a defile about 100 meters away. In turning, I glanced back in the direction from which we had come that morning and saw several dozen yellowish-brown steel helmets at the edge of the grain field near the narrow, sandy road. "Ivan's behind us," I said quickly. The Oberstleutnant smiled incredulously. "Those are probably your reinforcements." I looked closer. Our camo helmet covers don't shine in the sun. He stiffened and stood up. Engineer platoon, drivers, messengers, clerks, cooks, everybody out. Ivan's behind us. The men came scrambling out of the goal. Command post dugouts, and were assembled at that moment. The Russians attacked in company strength from the rear. I stood up with the others and fired blindly into the grain field. Machine gun fire forced us to the ground. Lying there, firing magazine after magazine into the field, I became aware of a shadow falling across me. I looked round and saw, 3 paces from where I was lying, the obus. Lieutenant, standing upright in the open, a small pistol in his belt, white leather gloves. More to the right, men, a lot more to the right, and take better aim. Silence. That machine gun. France. Give it a few bursts, he directed. The machine gunner hesitantly. I also got to my feet. From there, I could see something in a flash. All the men were up, and then came the immediate counterattack, whereupon the Russians stood up and ran straight into the well-aimed fires of the reinforcements coming up to help us. In the meantime, the whole battalion had closed up and joined in. A German aerial artillery observer began to circle over our heads. Artillery fought at last. But we were also in a hail of Russian shells bursting about our ears. The command posts received particular attention again. The aircraft circled low overhead, and again enemy shells screamed down with an uncanny precision. The men became worried. Heavy artillery joined in as well. The earth thundered and heaved. "This is stupid," cried Cole beside me. "The guy got to be a Russian." He pointed to the German aircraft. "CFT. True enough." As if to confirm his words, enemy shells started falling again with withering accuracy. The wounded could no longer be taken back. The command posts were shifted, and we combed through the village houses again. Radio messages flew back and forth between battalion and division. At last, we received permission to fire on the German aircraft, and the next time it approached, it was immediately ringed with bursting shells.
He went higher and circled once again. Enemy shells came down on our positions. Only then did the aircraft take off. A Fiesler, Stodge must have fallen into Ivan's hands at some point, and he was now using it against us, complete with its German markings. By evening, the enemy had been beaten and forced back towards the Rito marshes. As if to counterbalance that, the whole division then became involved in a violent defensive action along 10 kilometers of the main road. The 1st Battalion was on the right with the reconnaissance battalion next to it. To the left were the 2nd and 4th Battalions, with the latter battalion seeing action for the first time. There, over and over again, the Russians charged the lines of the division in seemingly endless waves and without any regard for casualties, attempted to penetrate our positions. Things got ugly in the sector of the reconnaissance battalion at first light on the 2nd day. Even though the men of the battalion were performing like heroes, when another gigantic massing of Red Army men advanced out of the woods to the north of the road and through a grain field. When it turned day, Schutz's infantry gun platoon fired ricochet rounds into them. The results were horrific. Working with the platoon from the reconnaissance battalion, the Russian thrust could be stopped and then eliminated. The Russians that had penetrated in the sector of the 1st Battalion were defeated. The casualties that the Red Army had to take were so heavy that their offensive efforts were derailed, and the division was able to gain more and more terrain. The plan of Marshal Budini to roll our entire right flank had failed. Up at last, there came a day's rest in the village of Muezin, where I met the first Ukrainian industrial workers I had seen. Employees from a neighboring pottery, one of them a Pole, spoke German well. I was desperately eager to talk to people from what one might expect to be the elite class within this workers' paradise. "How do we live?" "That's not difficult to tell you," he said in answer to my question. "We get about 400 rubles a month. A pair of shoes costs 500 to 600. A suit, at least
600 bread is 9 roos a loaf.
Meat, 15 roos. But no one can live on that," I said, astonished. The Pole shrugged his shoulders. "They don't think let that worry them. The director gets 3,000, of course, and the engineers, at least, 1,500. I began to wonder if I was hearing right. And not only that, he said. Our shops have different prices and goods from those used by the engineers, directors, and partymen. As a worker, you can't just buy where you want to, but only in the cooperative that has been assigned to you, and you can't buy what you like either, only what you're allocated. The NKVD, Red Army officers and party leaders, have other coups, other shops. We don't even know what they get there, but they look all right and dress well enough. Unlike us, said an old ethnic German woman who had elbowed her way up. And if you're allowed to buy a dress once in a year, and that often costs more than 400 rubles, maybe you want a green one, size 2. The salesman takes a red one, size 4, off the hook, because there's nothing else there, and you're happy just to have anything, something for which you've saved an entire year. But, I said, you've got your proletarian democracy. Why don't you do something about it? At the elections, there was general silence. For a moment, and then the little crowd that had gathered around rocked with laughter. The Pole had tears running down his cheeks. He thought my comment was so funny. The voting lists have always got Joseph Stalin and Molotov at the top. Then comes Yanov, Berrier, and the rest of the Central Committee. After that, you get the local candidates of the Communists and non-aligned bloc, all on one list. The only one allowed. It was all laid down in the election laws of 1936, drawn up by Stalin himself. There's no other list of candidates to vote on, and not voting is more than a little dangerous. It's called high treason. So if you value your life and freedom, you give your vote along with the rest. That's what's called proletarian democracy. The ethnic German women went on. The freely elected deputies represent the 16 Soviet republics, and 631 paid yes-men sit in the Supreme Soviet, 650 more in the Soviet of the Nationalities. The 53 ministers and 33 members of government are nothing more than departmental bureaucrats. All decisions are taken by the 14 men of the Politburo, the Central Committee, and these men decide the fate of 200 million. Yet they are not appointed to their posts by the millions whom they rule, nor by the 6 million party members, but solely and exclusively by the order of Joseph Stalin. His is the most absolute dictatorship history has known. Next to him, the Tsar, even Napoleon were babes in arms. What those Caesars tried to do, he has accomplished. He has established his dictatorship over doing and being, over sleeping and waking, over the bearing of children, over children and families themselves, over thought and speech, even over silence, and over life and death. He alone is master, accountable to none, not even to his own conscience, because he has none. And this, continued, the old woman, is what the world outside calls proletarian democracy. How far the fraud has succeeded is obvious from your question, German soldier. But within Russia itself, it has come to the point where men and women starve and want, thinking all is well, that is what life is. They cherish their chains, never having known anything different. Our conversation was cut short by the order to move that evening. We stopped in a fair-sized village. As soon as the locals saw that I was trying to make contact with them, hundreds of men and women clustered round me. An intelligent-looking youth caught me by the arm. "For years, we Ukrainians have been suffering and dying," he said. "Now it's our turn. We want nothing from you Germans. We are ready to do anything. Just give us rifles, give us ammunition." In his excitement, his last words poured out in Ukrainian, whereupon the crowd fell into a frenzy. "Pushka! Pushka!" the shout went up. "I'm just an ordinary soldier," I replied, deeply affected by their emotion. "But I hope your wish comes to pass. You see, Pan," the boy went on, "my father was an old Bolshevik who was sent to Siberia by the Tsar because he believed in liberty, equality and fraternity. Later on, he fought as a partisan, and we were very proud of him. But when he raised his voice in factory meetings against the senseless terror and the class distinctions in distributing food and goods, he disappeared and hasn't been seen since. The same happened to all the old guard. They suddenly became Trotskyites, sabots and traitors. These men who'd won power for the revolution and the workers' councils with their blood. You'll be lucky to find a dozen of them left in all of the Ukraine. The rest of them have been purged, branded as traitors and shot, or simply disappeared. They brought us liberty, the liberty to die if you don't knuckle under. They brought us equality, and equality with class distinctions, which couldn't be more rigid under the worst capitalist regime. The man who doesn't belong to the party doesn't get a special identity card, and the man without the card barely gets enough to live on. Fraternity they brought us to, the fraternity of the commissars and the bullet in the back of the head at the word commissar. The crowd went nearly frantic. The commissar cried, a crippled old man pointing to his deformed back. "I," the commissar cried, a young woman pointing to her missing toe. Younger women carried an older Ukrainian out to us on a primitive stretcher. She grasped my hands tightly with her skinny fingers and in a passionate whisper repeated again and again a few sentences that I could not understand. "She was the wife of our village priest," the boy said in a soft voice. When the Red Army pulled out, the commissars rounded up all the unreliable peasants and shot them. The woman's eyes held me in a fixed stare. Our priest and his 2 sons were among them, the youngest, 8 years old. She was prostrate with the shock, and now she's paralyzed. She wants you Germans to revenge her. She wants you to revenge each of her children 100-fold. "Pushka, Pushka," they all cried, men and women alike, overcome by the intensity of their passion. I pressed the many hands stretched out to me and turned away wordlessly.